In the previous lecture, we illustrated the VHS versus beta case study. That is a situation whereby, under the presence of two options, if one of the two starts being perceived as more successful than the other, then a self-reinforcing dynamic is activated, which terminates with the winner takes all situation. What I would like to do in this part and over the next part is to illustrate exactly what are the determinants of that type of dynamic and how we can improve our understanding of it. If we look at historical phenomena, we notice that often the change is not gradual, but happens via burst of sudden acceleration of change. Systems that had been stable for a long time, they suddenly experience a jolt of activity which redefines the configuration of the system. Examples of such phenomena are financial crashes, the 1929 financial crash, which redefined a new era in the 20th century, the French Revolution, or the emergence of companies such as Google or Facebook, which redefined search over the internet or redefined the meaning of social networks, virtual social networks. So in order to understand these, we need to understand what are the dynamics behind it. Let me give you a type of system that suffers from explosive change, in this case collapse, that leads to collapse, is constituted by electricity system. Let me give you an example. In 2012, extreme heat in India brought demand close to maximum, and for random reason one particular line situated in the state of Madhya Pradesh, more or less over there, tripped, which means was shut down, and when an electricity line shuts down, the carrying capacity, the power that that line carries, is distributed over the nearby lines. The nearby lines, if they are close to saturation, and in that case they were, exceeded their maximum capacity and were shut down as well. So the more lines, power lines, got out of the system, the more demand increased on the surviving lines, and they were not able to carry that demand, and this epidemic of failure spread across India. The result was that half of India was left without electricity, about more than 600 million people, and 222 states. Similar things have happened in most states, not only in emerging countries such as India. What is important to notice here is the dynamic, that a massive failure is not the sum of multiple independent failures, but it's an epidemic of failures that starts from a small event and spreads over, in that case, almost the entire system. Another example of epidemics or cascades of change is represented by financial markets. This is a famous cover that appeared on the magazine The Economist after the 1987 financial crash. Of course, this is a cartoon, but it reflects some of the underlying dynamics of a typical financial markets and the situation of stress. Let's imagine that there is somebody, probably influential, let's say George Soros or Warren Buffett, saying on the telephone, "I've got a stock here that could really excel." Really excel in English rhyme with sell, especially if the market expects some kind of change or suspects insider trading or whatever, then sell may lead to traders starting selling a certain type of shares. The more traders sell, the more they generate an epidemic of imitation of selling. Why? Either they may believe that the people selling have information they don't have, so it's better to join them, or in any case, if selling over surpasses buying, then the price of the share falls, short-term traders have an interest in keeping shares whose price is decreasing. So what the effect is an increase in selling, which may determine then panic in the system, with all people trying desperately to get rid of devalued shares. And we have seen this happening over and over again in financial markets. But then it's interesting that this may generate the opposite type of cascade. Let's say that in this frantic frenzy of a financial crash, a rational investor says, "This is madness. I can't take it anymore. Goodbye." And we know buy rhymes with buy. Now the market may swing violently on the opposite direction, generate an opposite frenzy, in this case of buying. And that may repeat. And we have seen that happening, especially in October 2008, which was probably the most volatile month in the history of financial market. Happened that often around the world. Notice that there's no relationship between the message goodbye and the ensuing reaction of the market. Other examples have to do with politics. For instance, the collapse of the former German democratic state, the communist state in Germany. 4 September 1989, a group of people manifested outside a church. The police didn't intervene for a number of reasons. A few weeks later, those manifestations became bigger and bigger, and then there was a massive demonstration, 70,000 people asking for freedom, for change. The police intervened, but now the system had got emboldened, and instead of being scared, more people joined, and then the entire city of Leipzig was protesting against the limitations imposed by the regime. That led to the collapse of the former German democratic state, and eventually it led to the collapse of the entire Soviet bloc. Notice again the relationship between few people manifesting out of a church and the massive scale of consequences that were triggered by such manifestations. A recent example of information cascades concerns the legislation about gay marriage in the United States. Notice that starting from 1992, there's a swing of states banning gay marriage, either by statute or by constitutional amendment. In 2002, the first exception appears, and I think that's New Jersey, that legalized gay marriage. For some years, nothing particularly happened, and then in 2006, an information cascade of imitation of the New Jersey's approach starts spreading in the United States. And in 2013, more than half of the states have legalized gay marriage. Notice that in this case, change first goes in direction anti-parity of gay marriages with heterosexual couple marriages, and then starting from 2006, the opposite direction. Legislation takes the opposite direction, a little bit as we saw in the case of financial markets. Information cascades are not typical only of modern times. They've always happened in the history of humankind. A stunning example is the madness that happened in the Netherlands in the 17th century around the price of tulips. Tulips went from a normal market in which buyers and sellers would operate around normal, let's say, prices. For certain reasons, that price started increasing. The more the price increased, the more the possibility of big profits could be achieved. That attracted speculators in. The more speculators joined, the more the price rised very, very quickly, till the value of a bulb, of a particularly prized variety could buy a flat in one of the richest cities in the world at that time. According to Charles Mackay, who wrote a book about what he calls the madness of crowds, a single bulb of a rare species could be exchanged for a huge amount of goods that could basically buy a house in Amsterdam. So far we have examined several examples of information cascades in multiple sectors. In order to understand the dynamics of information cascades, four concepts are important. The concept of butterfly effect, the concept of feedback, positive and negative, the concept of interdependence, of which we've already seen an effect when we looked at the VHS versus beta case study, and finally all of this happened in networks, and the structure of network is very important. When we talk about the structure of network, we talk about what type of network is it. Is it random? Is it ordered? Is it hierarchical? Is it not? Is it small world? Is it scale free? Etc. etc. Let's start with butterfly. Again, in the examples we have seen that massive change may be triggered by seemingly small events. The French Revolution started with a minor attack to what was effectively almost half empty prison, the Bastille, and then that redefined the history of whole Europe. Similarly, the Arab Spring that started in 2011 started with the suicide of one person in an isolated village in Tunisia, and that somehow grew over itself by a self-reinforcing dynamic, and then a few months later the entire Arab world was in rebellion, in turmoil. Butterfly effects happen in complex systems. We have seen complex systems in action, for instance, when we looked at simulations of complex systems, when we used the NetLogo simulation models. In general, according to Holland, almost all complex systems have some kind of very sensitive points whereby a small action, a small trigger may activate a process which results in radical change. This is known as a butterfly effect, and the metaphor is that the wings, so the flap of a butterfly wing in Brazil may set off a tornado in Texas. What is important to notice is that the relationship of cause and effect is not linear in this case. We tend to think that a large effect must be caused by a large cause. In order to destroy, let's say, a building, I need to operate with technology that is at least as strong as the building itself. Not when we're dealing with butterfly effect. When we looked at, for instance, the cartoon of The Economist, then a sentence uncorrelated with the dynamics of financial market might have triggered a bigger a financial crash or a financial boom. So the really important concept is the refutation on the concept of proportionality between cause and effect. In complex systems, you may have that radical change might be triggered by very small causes. Notice I'm talking about triggering and not causing. The second concept we need to understand cascades is the concept of feedback. What is a feedback? Any system is basically, we can treat any system as a black box. So we just put a boundary around the block, the system, then we may have an input going in and an output going out. Under certain condition, information about the output might be sent back to modulate the input, in order to tell the input increase or decrease according to the result of the action of the input on the system itself. In general, we have two classes of effect of the feedback on the dynamic of system. What we call positive feedback and negative feedback. Please notice that positive and negative do not refer to moral values. They don't have any moral dimension. They just reflect the two types of consequences ensuing a modulation of the input onto the output. Under certain conditions, a feedback causes a stabilization of the systems around the reference value, what we call a negative feedback. Negative means that the system opposes, negates the variation from the status quo, from the reference value. Whereas in a positive feedback, the input, the feedback serves to increase the input in order to multiply the output. We have seen an example of positive feedback when we looked at the winner-take-all dynamics in the VHS versus beta case. Example of negative feedback is stabilization of temperature in our organism. When the temperature in our body increases, rises above normal, then the brain acts to signal certain types of cells to expand, in this case dilate blood vessels, then sweating ensues. Sweating reduces the body temperature, then the body temperature drops toward normal. If it goes beyond normal now, if the body temperature is below the reference point, then the brain tells the sweating glands to stop sweating in order to make the temperature increase. Then under normal condition the body temperature rises toward normal, and this dynamic of vasodilation to reduce temperature, of vasoconstriction to increase temperature, makes the temperature of the body oscillates around the reference value. This is an example of a negative feedback. It's called homeostasis. If negative feedback is about stabilization of the system, it's about opposing variation from the initial state, positive feedback is the opposite. It's increasing. It's about increasing variation from the initial state. An example of positive feedback is an atomic chain reaction whereby one neutron may split an atom of uranium. When the atom splits, it generates energy and a further neutron. And you have two neutrons that can feed back on the system, split in two more atoms. The output is 4 neutrons that become now the input to further splitting. Now you've got 4 splitting, 8 neutrons, 8 splitting, 16 neutrons, and so on and so forth. The chain reaction advances, generates energy until you get the atomic explosion. This is not only characteristics of physics, but we find examples of positive feedback in social systems and in biology. An example in social systems has to do with the ranking of cities, whereby there would be a dominant city and then smaller city ranked in terms of population. Why that? Because the more a city gets ahead to the other, the more it tends to generate employment. The more it generates employment, the more it attracts people from other parts of the countries. It tends to attract the more entrepreneurial people. So the more entrepreneurial people flock to the Paris, the cities, or the San Franciscos of the world, the more they generate employment. The more they generate employment, the more they increase the attractiveness of that city to prospective seekers of employment. Of course, the more the attractiveness increases, the more people flock, the more employment, and so on and so forth, until you get that ranking, which is typical of many cities. Cancer is an example of positive feedback in biology, whereby cells, certain tumorous cells, start thwarting the feeding, nutrient feeding in the organism, so they create their own blood vessels. The more they create the blood vessel, the more they get nutrients. The more they get nutrients, the more they grow, until they expand and starve the rest of the organism. So to conclude, systems, both in the natural science and the social arena, may be subjected to radical fast change. Radical fast change happens because there's an information cascade of a certain type. We have seen several examples. We looked at two characteristics of radical explosive change. First, radical explosive change may be triggered by seemingly unimportant event that we call the butterfly effect. Second, an information cascade is fed by a positive feedback dynamic, whereby the more a certain situation happens, the more it creates the condition for the expansion of that type of dynamics. And that is what we called a positive feedback situation. So we close this lecture here. I just suggest readings, which are actually the same that I suggested in the previous part. Again, you'll find an excellent description of this dynamic in Watts, 6 degrees. Also Gladwell, the tipping point, illustrate how system may be stable, and then when a tipping point is achieved, then the dynamics changes very, very quickly. In the third part, I will look at network effects in details, and I will talk about contagion, different types of information cascades.